Just a nurse. That's what Dr. Pierce had written in the margin of her performance review 3 weeks ago, his handwriting sharp and derisive as a knife slash. Katie Rodriguez had read those 2 words while standing in the hospital corridor at 2,147 hours, her hand steady, her expression blank, her jaw the only thing that moved, a single muscle flexing once, then releasing. She'd folded the paper without comment and returned to her rounds as though the words meant nothing. They were wrong. He didn't see the way her hands moved. That was the problem with people like Dr. Pierce, they saw what they expected to see. A small woman in blue scrubs, dark hair pulled tight enough to hurt, eyes that stayed down when physician spoke. Competent enough for the grunt work. Deferential. Quiet. The kind of nurse who wouldn't ask questions that threatened comfortable arrangements or challenge the minor mathematics that padded certain billing codes. He didn't see the faded burn scars wrapping her left forearm like a sleeve, or the way she unconsciously scanned exit routes in every room before entering. He didn't see the way her breathing never changed when a patient screamed, or how her fingers moved through collapsed veins on the first stick while residents fumbled for ultrasound guidance. He didn't see the hospital bracelet from a San Diego trauma center dated 18 months ago, tucked inside her locker, commemorating 37 consecutive days without rotating out. He didn't see the legend walking past his desk. Seattle General's ER smells like bleach and fear under fluorescent lights that turn everyone corpse gray. The morning shift begins at 0600, and Katie Rodriguez is already in the supply room, inventorying central lines with the precision of someone counting ammunition. Her footsteps make no sound on the tile. Her movements are economical, no wasted motion, nothing extraneous. She's been a civilian for 4 years now, but her body remembers the mathematics of efficiency learned in places where hesitation cost lives. The stretcher rolls in at 0631, and the paramedics are already calling out vitals like they're reading an obituary. A male, 70s, unresponsive, found behind the Carlton Hotel on 5th, no wallet, no identification, blood pressure 88/52 and dropping. Katie moves toward the gurney without being asked. The attending physician, Dr. Holloway, is still swallowing his coffee. The resident is pulling up the electronic chart with no patient information to enter. The nursing assistant stands frozen, unsure where to start. Katie's voice is quiet, almost conversational. Someone get me 2 large ball lines and a unit of O negative. He's running dry. It's not a question. It's not a suggestion. The resident moves without understanding why his body is obeying someone who isn't technically senior staff. The nursing assistant's hands stop shaking and start working. The elderly patient is malnourished, weathered, his skin hanging loose on a frame built for more weight. His clothing is expensive once, a button-down shirt with the cuffs worn through at the elbows, a jacket that might have been navy blue 20 years ago. Katie works methodically through triage, documenting, inventorying, her touch gentle but absolutely professional. She's handled dying men before. This is just another one. She's cutting away the shirt when her fingers find it. A combat badge pinned inside the fabric, positioned directly over his heart. The metal is warm from his chest, the insignia unmistakable even under 3 decades of weathering, a Ranger tab, 75th Regiment. She stares at it for 2.3 seconds, her hands going absolutely still, her breathing pattern unchanged. The jacket lining is next. She's searching for identification, a wallet, any information the paramedics missed. Instead, she finds stitches, careful, deliberate stitching, done by someone who knew what they were doing. A faded unit patch, hand-sewn into the lining with the kind of precision you learn in the field where your uniform is your only identity. Kandahar, 2009 to 2011. 75th Regiment, Bravo Company. The same unit that took her son Daniel 3 years ago. She doesn't move. She doesn't speak. Her jaw flexes once, a single involuntary muscle contraction that would be invisible to anyone not trained to read the signs of absolute restraint. She catalogues the patches, the insignia, the unit designation with the part of her brain that never actually stopped being Captain Rodriguez. Then she logs the items on the intake form without comment, personal effects recovered. Combat memorabilia. Documented and secured. Just the facts. Just a nurse doing her job. Dr. Pierce watches from the physician's station, his eyes narrowed to something lethal and calculating. He's been watching her for exactly 3 weeks, ever since she'd asked about the medication discrepancies in room 12. Not accusingly. Just a simple question posed during a shift review. The discharge summary shows for antibiotics at $3,200 per unit, but the dispensary logs only document 2. Should I flag this for reconciliation? He'd smiled. It was the smile of someone who'd never been questioned before, and it didn't reach his eyes. Nurses don't reconcile documentation, Ms. Rodriguez. That's administrator work. Stick to your lane. Except Katie had already checked the lanes. She'd run the numbers on the side in her apartment at 0300 hours, cross-referencing the bills against the medication audits, and the discrepancies were systematic. Room 12 had been billed 47 times over the past year. The charges added up to $847,000 in pharmaceutical costs that bore no relationship to actual dispensing records. And room 12 wasn't the only one. The hospital billing system was like a military supply chain, predictable, quantifiable, vulnerable to the kind of inventory manipulation that required someone inside the system. Someone in administration. Someone with access to both the billing codes and the authority to override dispensing audits. Someone like Dr. Pierce, who served as both Chief of Emergency Medicine and sat on the Finance Committee that reviewed Medicare billing adjustments. He'd known instantly that she was a problem. Not because she'd threatened him directly, but because Katie had asked the right question in the right way, with the kind of careful precision that suggested she understood exactly what the numbers meant and had enough knowledge to ask follow-up questions that would be harder to dismiss. So Dr. Pierce had documented her insubordination. The first write-up was placed in her file on a Tuesday, questioned direct medical authority regarding routine billing procedures. Does not understand appropriate chain of command. The second appeared 3 days later, requested access to pharmaceutical inventory records without authorization. Security concern regarding HIPAA compliance. The third was dated last Monday, continued pattern of challenging institutional policy. Negative attitude affects team morale. Requires remedial education on appropriate staff roles. All 3 were handwritten in his careful cursive, all 3 signed and dated, all 3 completely deniable if she tried to raise concerns. A paper trail that made her look like an insubordinate, paranoid, chronically questioning employee. If she pushed the billing issue, the documentation was already there to explain why she'd been terminated for cause. He was competent. Katie had to grant him that much. This wasn't a man who yelled or threatened directly. This was a man who understood institutional architecture, who knew how to weaponize bureaucracy, who could destroy someone's career without ever raising his voice above a conversational tone. Now, watching her handle the unconscious patient with absolute competence, her hands moving through and for insertion with the kind of precision that came from doing it thousands of times, Dr. Pierce made another note on his tablet. Something to add to the file. Something to document that she was becoming increasingly obsessive about patient care details, asking questions about the elderly man's belongings, lingering over the intake procedures longer than necessary. That kind of excessive attention to detail could be characterized as obsessive behavior. Potentially unstable. The kind of employee who might eventually have a breakdown under the pressure of the job. It would all be there in the paperwork when the time came. Katie finishes the 4 placement with the second line going in on the first attempt, the needle finding the vein as if guided by something beyond conscious thought. Dr. Holloway finally enters the trauma bay, his coffee still warming his hand, and begins making orders that Katie is already anticipating: fluid bolus, type and cross, EKG, chest X-ray. She moves through the procedures like water finding its path, never rushing, never hesitating, her movements economical and precise. The elderly man's oxygen saturation is climbing, 72, 78, 84, 91. Stable. His blood pressure is responding to the fluid resuscitation. He's not going to crash in the next 15 minutes, which means Katie has time to document, time to think, time to process what she's found sewn into the lining of his jacket. She excuses herself to the charting station and begins entering the patient information. Male, age approximately 72, brought in by EMS, no identification, no emergency contact information available. And in the personal effects section, 3 words, combat memorabilia. Ranger insignia. She could have flagged it for possible veterans outreach. She could have mentioned it to the social work department. She could have done any number of things that a normal nurse would do. But Katie isn't normal, and this isn't just another patient. The 75th Regiment patch from Kandahar means something very specific. It means this man was part of the military operation that took her son. It means he was there, that he possibly knew Daniel, that he might have been the person who could have called for evacuation or backup or anything at all that might have changed the outcome on that August afternoon when a roadside IED took a 19-year-old boy and 6 of his brothers in arms. She logs out of the system and returns to the patient's bedside. The old man is still unconscious, his breathing controlled by the ventilator's steady wheeze, his vital signs displayed on the monitors like a narrative written in numbers. She doesn't touch him. She simply stands at the bedside, very still, her hands at her sides, her expression blank. What happened next would change everything. The Grand Rounds conference room smelled like old coffee and ambition, the kind of space where reputations were built or dismantled in front of an audience. 20 residents packed the room at 0900, their white coats still crisp from the morning, their eyes tracking Dr. Pierce as he clicked through slides with the precision of someone who'd spent 20 years teaching younger doctors exactly how much they didn't know. Katie stood against the back wall where nurses belonged, her hands clasped at her sternum, her face the color of institutional beige. Pierce wore his white coat like a general wore dress blues, embroidered nameplate in navy thread, 5 credentials trailing his surname like a tail that whispered power. He was handsome in the way men with institutional authority often are, his jawline sharp enough to cut glass, his voice pitched to carry without seeming to strain. He clicked to a slide showing medication interactions, the kind of foundational pharmacology that every nurse and resident should know without thinking. "Let's test practical knowledge," Pierce announced, his eyes scanning the room before landing on her. "Nurse Rodriguez. Step forward, please." The residents turned as one organism. She walked to the front, hands still clasped, her face blank as slate. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, a sound like bees trapped in glass. "Explain the interaction between warfarin and ciprofloxacin," Pierce said. "Mechanism of action. Go." She began without hesitation, her voice steady and low. Ciprofloxacin inhibits CYP1A2 and CYP3A4, reducing warfarin metabolism, which increases INR and bleeding risk significantly. We monitor PT-INR values every 2 to 3 days during concurrent therapy. Standard dosing adjustment. He cut her off with a theatrical sigh that seemed to come from somewhere deep in his chest, a sound designed to communicate disappointment to everyone in the room simultaneously. Wrong. Completely wrong. This is exactly why nurses need physician supervision for anything beyond basic bedside tasks. He turned to face the residents, his body language open and confident, a man standing in his element. The actual mechanism involves gut flora disruption reducing vitamin K synthesis, not enzyme inhibition, though that plays a minor role she failed to mention. He smiled, the kind of smile that came with teeth. "You're dismissed, Rodriguez. Try reviewing fundamentals." A resident in the front row, a woman with red hair and uncomfortable posture, shifted her weight. Katie had been describing the primary mechanism, the one listed in every pharmacology textbook published in the last decade. Pierce had cited the secondary mechanism, the one that mattered less in clinical practice. But the residents wouldn't question him. Nobody questioned Dr. Pierce. He was the attending physician. He was the man who signed their evaluations. Katie walked back to her position against the wall, her jaw muscles the only thing that moved beneath her skin. She could feel the weight of 20 pairs of eyes, could sense the small current of pity mixed with something darker, schadenfreude, perhaps, the quiet pleasure of watching someone else be humiliated. It happened in every hospital in America. Nurses were props in other people's stories. The morning continued. She drew labs, changed dressings, titrated vasopressors on a septic patient in bed for whose family couldn't understand why he was still declining despite everything they were doing. By 1100, she needed air, needed to exist in a space where Pierce wasn't the dominant gravitational force. She fed quarters into the vending machine outside the break room, watching them drop and disappear, listening to the mechanical grinding of gears that would dispense a coffee she didn't want. She just needed somewhere to stand that wasn't near the patient rooms where Pierce might appear with his trailing cloud of authority. 10 feet away, 2 attendings laughed. She recognized them, both men in their 40s, both connected to Pierce through the private anatomy of hospital hierarchies. Golf partners, probably. The kind of friendships built on mutual professional interest and the understanding that loyalty moved upward in medical institutions. "Did you hear about the nurse who thinks she's smarter than physicians?" one said, his voice pitched to carry. "The medic, they're calling her," the other laughed, the sound sharp as broken glass. "Pierce says she questions his orders, undermines him in front of residents." Katie's hand didn't shake as she retrieved her coffee from the dispenser. The cup was hot enough to burn if she held it wrong, but she held it exactly right, her fingers positioned where they wouldn't hurt. She didn't turn around. She didn't acknowledge that she'd heard. She drank the coffee in 3 swallows, it tasted like burnt water and humiliation, and returned to the floor without speaking to anyone. By 1400, she was in the break room reviewing her John Doe's deteriorating labs, cross-referencing his fingerprints through a veterans database on her break using credentials she absolutely was not supposed to have. She'd obtained them 3 years ago from an Army Reserve officer she'd met at her son's funeral, credentials that operated in a gray zone between legal and catastrophic if discovered. The database had never returned a match before. This time, the screen flickered and populated with a name: Warren James Mitchell. Lieutenant Colonel, retired. 75th Ranger Regiment. 3 tours. Kandahar, 2019. The room's air pressure changed. She was still staring at the screen when Dr. Pierce appeared behind her with 2 security guards, his voice carrying across the break room with the weight of institutional authority. "Misuse of hospital systems, unauthorized database access. I could have you escorted from the building right now, Rodriguez." She could see his reflection in the monitor, his face arranged into an expression of disappointment, the same theatrical mask he'd worn during grand rounds. But underneath it, something else lived. Something that looked like fear. She'd gone looking for information, and that was the one thing Dr. Pierce couldn't control. She logged out without a word, the system asking if she wanted to save changes. She did not, and she stood, her movements precise and unhurried. She met his eyes for exactly 1 second with a face made of stone, the kind of calm that comes from having already survived the worst. Then she walked past him, past the security guards who seemed uncertain whether they'd actually been instructed to physically remove a nurse from the building, and returned to her rounds as if he were simply air, a pressure change, something the body registered but the mind dismissed. He called after her, "One more incident. Just one more, Rodriguez." She didn't acknowledge that she'd heard. She simply continued walking, her shoes making soft sounds against the tile floor, the rhythm of someone who'd walked through worse than this. At 1745, the storm rolled in from the west, turning the sky purple-black and shaking the windows of Seattle General hard enough that someone called maintenance about checking the structural integrity of the ER bay doors. All medevac helicopters were grounded by 1800. The dispatch radio crackled every 3 minutes with trauma surgeons calling from their cars, stuck on flooded highways, giving eaters that kept pushing further into the evening. Dr. Chen, the thoracic surgeon, called from his vehicle at 1945 minutes out, roads getting worse, earliest realistic arrival 22:30, possibly later. Katie checked her John Doe at 2100, his blood pressure dropping like a stone, his heart rate climbing into the 140s, his skin going the particular shade of gray that meant his body was running out of oxygen. The room seemed to get smaller around her. She reviewed his chest X-ray on the monitor, pulling up the image from admission and comparing it to the one from 1900. The mediastinum was widening. She'd noticed it before, had flagged it in her notes, but it was getting worse. Aortic dissection forming. She paged the thoracic surgeon again. Voicemail. She paged the charge nurse. Chen was now estimated at 2,245, roads deteriorating, ETA uncertain. Katie did the math in her head the way she'd learned to do it in Kandahar, quick and brutal and honest. The patient had maybe 30 minutes at this rate of decompensation. Chen needed at least 45. The gap was math that always ended the same way. She returned to his bedside, checked the cardiac monitor showing the telltale pattern of someone whose body was starting to fail, and leaned close to his ear. "Can you hear me? I found your regiment patch. 75th Rangers, Kandahar, 2019. His lips moved, barely audible. "Warren. Lieutenant Colonel." His voice sounded like wind through a broken window. "Who?" Then his eyes closed again. But that wasn't the worst part. At 21:45, Dr. Pierce appeared in the patient's bay, his face arranged into professional concern that looked authentic if you didn't know how to read the absence of something behind his eyes. "This patient is DNR status as of 1 hour ago," he announced, his voice carrying the weight of institutional authority. "No extraordinary measures. Are we clear, Rodriguez?" Katie checked the digital record. The DNR order was there, entered at 2,100, physician signature type below, Dr. Pierce. The patient had been unconscious since arrival. No family had consented. No capacity assessment had been documented. The order existed in the system like a ghost someone had planted there. She looked at Pierce, then at Lieutenant Colonel Warren, then back at the attending physician who controlled her employment and her future. "His full code according to admission paperwork," she said quietly. Her voice didn't shake. Her hands didn't tremble. She was thinking in Kandahar now, thinking in the kind of clarity that came when everything else fell away except the mathematics of survival. Pierce stepped closer, his presence making the air pressure change. "I'm the attending physician. Chart says DNR. Your job is to follow orders, not question them." He turned to leave, then stopped, a small afterthought designed to land harder than anything he'd said so far. "Actually, you're reassigned. Send Martinez to cover this patient. You're on discharge paperwork the rest of the night." He was removing her from the patient. She understood then, with the kind of clarity that tasted like copper, what was actually happening. The pharmaceutical discrepancies she'd noticed weeks ago. The Medicare billing irregularities. The patient charges that didn't match what had actually been dispensed. A John Doe with no family, no identity, no one to question his care or his billing. A patient dying from a dissection that could be managed surgically if someone wanted to manage it. Dr. Pierce needed this patient to die quietly, needed the paperwork to close cleanly, needed the nursing staff reassigned so no one could testify later about what they'd observed. The room went so quiet you could hear the ventilator wheeze its mechanical rhythm, steady as a metronome counting down. The storm hit Seattle General's ER at 18:47 hours like the prelude to something apocalyptic. The sky went purple-black in 7 minutes, and Katie watched from the nurse's station as rain hammered the windows hard enough to rattle the frames. Thunder rolled across Atlanta in waves, and the building shook like a ship in heavy seas. The meteorologists had gotten it wrong, the system was supposed to track south. Instead, it stalled directly over the hospital, and the wind speed climbed past 40 miles per hour. By 1900, dispatch started calling in flood reports. Traffic signals on Peachtree Avenue were underwater. The interstate ramps were becoming rivers. Dr. Pierce stood at the ambulance entrance with his phone pressed to his ear, and Katie could read the irritation crossing his face from 30 feet away. The medevac coordinator was calling. The Blackhawks couldn't fly in these conditions. Visibility was 12 feet. Ground effect winds were exceeding safe flight parameters. All helicopter traffic was grounded effective immediately, indefinite duration. Pierce's jaw tightened. He disconnected the call without saying goodbye. By 1930, the first wave of storm-related trauma arrived. A multi-vehicle pileup on the flooded Connector Road. A structural collapse at a parking garage on 8th Avenue. A man who'd been electrocuted trying to restore power to a substation. The ER filled in 40 minutes like a bathtub with the drain plugged. Katie moved between bays with practiced efficiency, triaging, stabilizing, documenting vitals, knowing that every patient she touched was now prisoner to the weather. The trauma surgeons called. Dr. Martinez, the thoracic specialist, was trapped in his car on Highway 85. Water had risen suddenly across the roadway, and he wasn't attempting to cross. His estimated time of arrival was unknown. He might sit there for 3 hours. He might not arrive at all. Dr. Chen, the vascular surgeon, had abandoned his vehicle and was walking toward Grady Memorial, 4 miles north, in case he was needed there instead. Dr. Patel had given up. He was sheltering in a hotel off Cobb Parkway and wouldn't risk the drive. The ER had exactly 1 attending physician on premises, Dr. Pierce, and 0 backup surgeons. Katie continued her rounds. Bay 3, 34-year-old male with a compound fracture of the femur and pelvic trauma, needing operative reduction. Bay 5, 52-year-old female with a crushed hand from a collapsing scaffold, needing microvascular repair. Bay 8, a pediatric drowning victim who'd been revived by bystanders, now sedated and ventilated, needing ICU monitoring and probable neurointervention. In normal circumstances, those 3 patients alone would have had surgeons standing over them by now, hands ready, operating rooms being prepped on the 2nd floor. In this circumstance, they were waiting for a man who had no intention of saving them. Katie hung a bag of normal saline for the drowning child, checked the ventilator settings, rate 12, tidal volume 480 milliliters, FiO2 0.60, and moved toward the bay where John Doe lay. The elderly ranger's vital signs were drifting. His blood pressure had been 148/87 at 1800. At 1900, it read 142/84. At 1930, it was 138/81. The numbers were subtle, a 2-point per minute decline that most people wouldn't notice across a 30-minute window. Katie had tracked aortic dissections in Kandahar field hospitals. She knew what a dying aorta looked like on the monitor before it decided to perforate. She knew the color of a patient's skin when the bleeding was starting internally, when the pressure was dropping 1 beat at a time, when death was negotiating terms. The elderly ranger had that color now. Pale at the edges of his nail beds. A faint shine of sweat on his forehead despite the 4 fluids running wide open. His breathing was getting shallower, pulling from the shoulders instead of the belly. She checked the chart. Pierce had entered a DNR order at 1845, do not resuscitate. DNR on a trauma patient. DNR on a ranger who'd served 41 years in the Army. DNR on a man with no family listed, no ID, no one to advocate for him except a nurse who was supposed to be invisible. Katie moved to the next bay. She had orders. She had assignments. She had 12 hours left on her shift and a paycheck that depended on following the protocols of a man who was currently standing at the physician's station, his back turned toward the chaos he'd created, his phone in his hand, probably billing Medicare for consultations he'd never made. The ER was running on fumes. The resident physicians were rotating between bays like circus performers on roller skates, pulling off minor interventions, calling for senior supervision that wasn't coming. The nurses were running a trauma center with no surgeons. The waiting room had filled beyond capacity, people with broken arms, possible concussions, abdominal pain, chest pain, stroke symptoms, all waiting for beds that didn't exist. 3 patients were sitting in the hallway on stretchers. One was actively vomiting into a kidney basin while a medical student held it for her. Katie passed Pierce at 1955. He was reviewing something on his computer, his back turned. He didn't acknowledge her. His shoulders carried the tension of a man watching something go wrong and choosing not to intervene. Muscle memory from Kandahar told her what that meant. Pierce needed the storm to rage. Pierce needed the surgeons to stay trapped on highways. Pierce needed every patient who required operative intervention to deteriorate into a state where they'd be past saving even if a surgeon miraculously arrived. Because dead patients didn't testify about billing fraud. Dead patients didn't trigger investigations. Dead patients closed cleanly on their own. At 2000, the meteorologist on the news updated her forecast. The system was stalling. The worst of it was still 7 to 10 hours out. The rain wouldn't stop until dawn. The winds would peak at midnight. The flooding would get worse before it stabilized. Katie moved to the supply closet near Bay 8 and began counting sutures. 44 packages of 3.0 silk. 22 packages of 4.0 polypropylene. Enough for minor laceration repair. Nothing for the major trauma cases accumulating in Bays 3, 5, and 8. An intern named Dr. Patel, no relation to the vascular surgeon, appeared at her elbow. He was 26, maybe 27, with dark circles under his eyes and a voice that shook. The patient in Bay 3 is asking when surgery is happening. I told him we're waiting for Dr. Martinez. He's saying his leg is going numb. I think the swelling is compressing the femoral nerve. Katie set down the suture packs. What did Dr. Pierce say? I can't find him. He went to his office 20 minutes ago. Of course he did. Katie nodded slowly. Call the orthopedic attending at Grady. Tell them we might need to transfer. Get an ambulance staged if the road's clear enough. Until then, elevate the leg, ice around the fracture site, check distal pulses every 15 minutes. Document everything. But we can't transfer until. Document everything, Katie repeated. Her voice had dropped an octave, turned into the voice of someone who'd made triage decisions in places where documentation was the only thing that kept people alive. Dr. Patel nodded without understanding why and hurried back to Bay 3. The rain intensified. The windows rattled. A crash echoed from somewhere in the parking garage, probably a section of structure failing, probably a car getting crushed, probably another patient arriving within the hour. Katie moved between bays, checking lines, adjusting medications, watching numbers tick downward on monitors. The child in Bay 8's oxygen saturation was holding at 94%. The male with pelvic trauma was maintaining pressure at 136/79. The female with the crushed hand was alert and coherent, her pain managed by a carefully titrated morphine drip. And in the corner bay where no one was assigned to watch, John Doe's blood pressure ticked down another 2 points. Katie passed him on her way to the central supply area. She didn't stop. She didn't deviate. She walked like a nurse executing orders, carrying supplies, doing the invisible work that kept a hospital breathing. But her peripheral vision caught the monitor readout. 136/78. The ranger's respirations were up to 20. His heart rate was climbing, 94, 96, 98, the compensatory tachycardia that came right before the body started losing ground. She had 40 minutes left before his aorta decided it was done negotiating. The noise in the ER became the background texture of her world. The ventilators wheezed their mechanical rhythm. The monitors beeped and chirped and alarmed. The intercom crackled with incoming ambulance notifications. Nurses called for help lifting patients. Residents debated treatment options. The storm raged outside and the hospital shook, and Katie Rodriguez, wearing her scrubs like a disguise, like a uniform she wasn't supposed to remember how to wear, continued her rounds and waited for the moment when rules became optional and the only thing that mattered was whether a man lived or died in the next 60 seconds. The clock on the wall showed 2023. The elderly ranger's blood pressure read 132/75. 3 bays away, an alarm started chirping, the vascular surgery patient's blood pressure rising, her heart rate climbing. Stress response. Pain breakthrough. Someone needed the attending, and the attending was behind closed doors, watching the storm and probably smiling. Katie walked past the physician station without slowing. She heard Pierce's door open behind her. She heard him sigh like a man who'd remembered he had paperwork to do. She felt his presence like a pressure change in the room, the kind of awareness that came from training in environments where the wrong decision meant people didn't come home. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that she already knew what he was going to do next. The worst part was that she'd seen this calculation in Kandahar, seen it in forward operating bases, seen it in the eyes of commanders deciding which soldiers got medical evacuation and which ones got left behind because the resources didn't exist. The worst part was that she recognized the particular flavor of institutional murder that Pierce was committing right now, and she understood that the only thing separating the civilized world from barbarity was people like her, people with no authority, people with nothing to lose except the thing they'd already sacrificed, the ability to look away. The monitor's pitch changed at 0200. Not a gentle escalation, a sharp, screaming climb that meant aortic dissection, meant the elderly patient's main artery was tearing itself apart from the inside out. Katie was 3 rooms away, charting vitals on a post-op patient when the alarm cut through the ambient hum of machines. She moved before thinking, muscle memory faster than conscious decision. The storm outside hammered the ER windows like it wanted in, wind shaking the glass, rain coming sideways through the parking lot. No helicopters would fly in this. No medevac. No exit. John Doe's pressure was dropping fast. 70 for over 40. The resident, Dr. Kim, stood frozen at the bedside, eyes locked on the monitor where the waveform had gone chaotic. Katie pulled up the chart, already coded him once at 1840, stabilized with fluids, but the CT scan had shown the beginning of the dissection. Contained. Stable. Until it wasn't. Dr. Pierce's DNR order sat there in the electronic record like a loaded gun, but Katie had already made her calculation in Kandahar and made it again in this moment. She was going to save this man's life or she was going to lose her job trying. "Get me a 14-gauge angiocath," she said to Kim, her voice dropping into a register that made the younger doctor's head snap up. 2 large-bore 4s. Activate the rapid infuser. Push 1 milligram epinephrine. Not requests. Commands. The kind of voice she hadn't used in 3 years, the voice of someone who'd called for air support on a rooftop while rounds were walking closer. The thoracic surgeon lived 20 miles out. With the bridge flooded, he wasn't arriving in less than 40 minutes. John Doe would be dead in 5. Katie moved to the code cart and opened the equipment drawer with one hand while the other was already reaching for her boot. The combat knife was still there, same place she'd carried it for 14 years, a Ka bar with an edge that could split skin like paper, tested not on training dummies but on real flesh in a forward operating base outside Kandahar where field hospitals didn't have time for surgical scalpels. She'd turned it in once, during demobilization, and they'd handed it back during the classified briefing with the instruction never to acknowledge it existed. She held it up. Dr. Kim's face went white. "This patient is coding from aortic dissection," Katie said, her hand steady as surgical steel. "The thoracic surgeon cannot arrive in time. A field thoracotomy gives him a chance. Without it, he codes again and there's no resuscitation from that." She looked at Kim. "Are you with me?" Kim nodded, terrified, and committed in equal measure. Katie cut through the chest wall with one clean line, the knife moving with the terrifying fluid precision of someone who'd done this on combat tourniquets and bleeding soldiers. The rib spreaders went in next, standard surgical instrument, thank God for that small mercy of legitimacy, and Kim held them with shaking hands as the thoracic cavity opened. The dissecting aorta was right there, bleeding into the pericardium, the anatomy screaming what was happening. She clamped above and below with a satin sky clamp, controlled precision, and the bleeding stopped. The monitor's alarm note changed, lower, steadier. Pressure climbing. 76, 82. 88. Dr. Pierce had arrived without her noticing, standing in the doorway of the ER bay like he'd been summoned by his own name. His face went the color of old concrete. "What are you doing?" Not a question. An accusation. "Stop right now. Step back from that patient. This is assault, this is gross negligence, I'm calling the police, I'm calling hospital security, you are violating a DNR order I personally entered." Katie ignored him the way you ignore background noise. The patient's eyes opened, unfocused and confused, and locked onto her face 6 inches away. His lips moved. The sound came out rough as gravel, "Captain Rodriguez." The name hit her like a flashbang grenade, that moment of white bright disorientation before the world realigned. She knew that voice. Older now, weakened by years and sedation, but she knew it. She'd heard it once, giving orders during Operation Copper Dagger, heard it once more on a satellite phone 3 years ago in a notification that started with "We regret to inform you." This was Lieutenant Colonel Warren. This was the man who'd commanded the unit that had taken her son. This was the man who'd written Daniel's letter home. "Hold on," she said, and clipped the clamp in place. "Just hold on." The patient's eyes closed again, but his pressure held. Stayed above 90. The monitor's rhythm steadied into something that approached sinus. Katie's hands were covered in blood and her breath was coming steady and her entire world had just inverted, but her fingers didn't shake. Dr. Chen, the thoracic surgeon, arrived at 0230, dripping wet from the parking lot, still buttoning his coat. He took one look at the open chest cavity and the field placement and said, "Jesus Christ, who did this?" "I did," Katie said. She wasn't hiding. Not anymore. Patient was agonal rhythm. No choice. Chen examined the clamp placement, the incision line, the controlled hemorrhage. His expression cycled through shock and then something else. Professional respect, maybe. This is combat medicine. Where did you? But he didn't finish, already moving, already taking over, already knowing that someone in this ER had training that didn't match her badge. Dr. Pierce had stepped back into the hallway. Katie watched him pull his phone out, his movements sharp and controlled. Call 1 lasted 90 seconds. Call 2 lasted 2 minutes. Call 3 lasted exactly 30 seconds. His voice never rose. That was the terrifying part, the absolute control in his tone as he spoke to people in offices, people who owed him favors, people who would move mountains if he asked. He was already consolidating, already calling in markers, already making phone calls to the state medical board and hospital legal and the malpractice carrier. He was competent at this. Disturbingly, methodically competent. By 0800, Katie was sitting in the administrator's office. Mrs. Walsh, the HR director, had her tablet open to the termination letter. It was already written. Not a rough draft, final language, signed by Pierce, waiting only for Katie's signature acknowledging receipt. Termination effective immediately. The violations listed were precise, unauthorized surgical procedure, violation of end-of-life order, use of non-medical instrument in patient care, insubordination, gross negligence endangering patient safety. The state medical board has been notified, Walsh said quietly, and Katie could hear the apology underneath. Hospital legal is recommending we move quickly on separation to limit liability. Pierce stood behind the desk with his arms crossed, his face carefully arranged into an expression of regret. The performance of someone who just had to make a difficult but necessary decision. "You put this hospital at serious risk," he said. "A patient explicitly marked DNR, and you ignored that order. You used a weapon on a human being in an emergency department. You violated every protocol we have." He paused, let the silence build. "I have no choice but to recommend immediate termination." Katie said nothing. Her hands were folded on the desk. Her face was blank. She'd learned composure from people who'd survived things that would break normal humans, and she wasn't going to give Pierce the satisfaction of seeing her flinch. 2 security guards were waiting outside the office. They walked her through the ER, the same ER where she'd worked for 3 years, the same hallway where nurses she'd trained with looked away as she passed, their eyes sliding off her face. Pierce had moved them to different shifts during the night. Witnesses scattered. A cardinal move in the game of institutional protection. Her belongings fit in one cardboard box. A coffee mug from Daniel's middle school fundraiser. A photograph of her son in dress blues, the portrait taken the week before the IED. A spare set of scrubs still wrapped in plastic. The lobby doors closed behind her at noon, Atlanta sun bright enough to burn. By 1600 she was sitting at her kitchen table still wearing the blood-stained scrubs, unable to remember how to take them off. The front door opened at 16:30, Daniel, home from school, 15 years old and confused by the sight of his mother sitting in full uniform with nowhere to go. "Mom." His voice was uncertain. Why are you home? She couldn't answer. The words were there but her throat was closing around them, and then the dam broke in a way it hadn't since Kandahar, since the classified operation that had erased her records and given her a new social security number with instructions never to surface again in any government database. Daniel stood frozen, terrified, watching his mother shake with something that looked like grief but was actually rage. The phone rang at 1847 exactly, 3 hours after the termination paperwork entered the hospital system. The phone rang 6 times before Daniel answered, his voice cracking with the sound of someone watching their mother unravel. She's not available right now. Katie sat at the kitchen table still wearing her scrubs, the fabric damp from rain and sweat, her hands wrapped around a coffee mug that had gone cold an hour ago. The scrubs were evidence now. Evidence of a life that had just evaporated. Walsh's voice on the other end of the line was careful, measured, the way people speak when they're delivering news they don't fully understand. This is Seattle General. Please tell your mother the army is here. They need to speak with her. It's very important. Daniel hung up and looked at his mother with the terrible clarity only teenagers possess. The army? Katie nodded without speaking. She couldn't speak. The country she'd bled for had ordered her erased, and now it was calling her home like a soldier who'd gone AWOL. She stood, moved to the mirror, and saw a woman who looked like a stranger wearing her face. Red-rimmed eyes. Hair coming loose from its bun. Scrub pants with a coffee stain on the knee from this morning's shift, this morning's existence, before everything became past tense. She showered in silence, changed into civilian clothes, and felt the absence of uniform like missing teeth. When she came back downstairs, Daniel was waiting by the door with a jacket. He didn't ask questions. He'd learned not to. Seattle General's lobby at 1930 hours smelled like antiseptic and rain-soaked carpet. The Army General was waiting near the fountain, standing with the kind of stillness that comes from command, from having made decisions that cost lives. He was in dress uniform, the kind you wear when something matters enough to leave nothing to chance. When he saw Katie, he saluted. She hesitated for 3 seconds, an eternity, before returning it, her arm rising from muscle memory older than her civilian identity. The general's eyes tracked the movement and recognized what it meant, a soldier who'd been trained so thoroughly that the country couldn't erase that even when it tried. Captain Rodriguez, he said. I'm General Holloway. We need to talk. The conference room felt too small for what was about to happen. Pentagon investigators sat across from her, 2 FBI agents occupying chairs near the window, a woman with Defense Intelligence Agency credentials on her lanyard, and Lieutenant Colonel Warren's voice arriving through a secure video feed from his hospital bed 2 floors up. The general laid it out with military precision. Her background check had triggered a DOD security flag that locked Seattle General's entire HR system at 1,147 hours. The flag had called Washington. Washington had called Atlanta. Everything that followed moved at the speed of federal authority. Dr. Pierce accessed the military personnel database 43 minutes after your termination, the DIA investigator said. She was a woman with the kind of face that suggested she'd seen classified things that couldn't be unseen. His keystroke logs show he attempted to verify your records. To prove they were forged. She slid a tablet across the table. Katie's DD-214 filled the screen, her discharge papers, redacted section stamped classified in sharp black letters, her award citation beneath it, her name authorized for records erasure by presidential order. The kind of paperwork that only existed if you'd been somewhere the government didn't officially acknowledge. When he tried to access those files, the FBI agent continued, he triggered a federal lockdown. His attempt to prove you were lying became evidence of his guilt. The agent tapped his pen against his notepad. We've been watching his billing fraud for 8 months, Captain. Your questions about the pharmaceutical inventory discrepancies created an opening. You made him nervous. When he terminated you, that nervousness turned into desperation, and desperation made him sloppy. The DIA investigator leaned forward. Your clearance was never revoked. When you accessed that veterans database using your real credentials, you were acting within your authorized parameters. Dr. Pierce didn't know that. What he saw was a nurse accessing restricted systems, and he thought it was leverage. She paused. It wasn't. It was confirmation that we needed to move. Katie's hands remained perfectly steady on the table. Her jaw didn't tighten. Her voice, when it came, carried the flat tone of someone processing data. What's Warren's prognosis? Stable, Dr. Chen answered from the doorway. She'd been waiting in the hall, Katie realized. Watching the cascade fall. The field thoracotomy saved his life. Whoever trained you understood emergency medicine at a level most trauma surgeons never reach. Dr. Chen's eyes met Katie's. You saved him. Lieutenant Colonel Warren's voice came through the speakers with the careful diction of a man still partly sedated. She saved my life, General. Captain Rodriguez performed advanced surgical intervention under field conditions with nothing but a knife and the kind of training you only get in one place. She's exactly who I thought she was. A pause. She's exactly who we've both always been. The General placed a folder on the table. Inside it, Dr. Pierce's arrest warrant, 17 counts of Medicare fraud totaling $2.3 million, his medical license suspension notice already filed, his malpractice insurance cancelled effective immediately. The perp walk footage was already circulating, filmed by a visitor's phone, shared by the evening news, playing on loop with the kind of schadenfreude that only comes when the public realizes the person in handcuffs had been stealing from them. We're offering you two paths, General Holloway said. The hospital has authorized a full reinstatement. Your choice of position. Pierce's former title, if you want it. Back pay from the moment of termination. Full benefits. He tapped the folder. Or you can take medical leave, and we can have you report for active duty reactivation. There are operations in planning that would benefit from your skill set. Katie thought about that for 10 seconds. She thought about the weight of a rifle that she hadn't held in 3 years. She thought about commanding soldiers again, making decisions that cost lives, living in the darkness. She thought about why she'd become a nurse instead. She thought about Daniel waiting in the lobby downstairs, trying to be brave, trying to understand why his mother's country had treated her like a ghost. I'm a nurse, she said. That's what I want to be. The General nodded. Then you'll take the shift supervisor position. You'll have authority to question treatment decisions. You'll have access to pharmaceutical oversight. You won't report to Dr. Chen anymore. You'll report to me. It wasn't a request. It was a command in different uniform. They offered her Pierce's office. She refused and asked for his old hours instead, nights and weekends, the shifts where you learned who people really were, where you saw them at their breaking point. The residents learned within the first week that the nurse supervisor with the small silver star on her lanyard knew more about saving lives than most physicians would learn in 10 years. Nobody questioned her anymore. The ones who'd watched her in silence during grand rounds, the ones who'd heard the vending machine mockery and done nothing, they learned to listen when she spoke. 6 months later, someone mailed her a photograph. No return address, but the postmark was Washington State. The image showed Dr. Pierce in a community college gymnasium, fluorescent lights casting shadows across his face, his hands positioned on a plastic dummy's chest. He was teaching CPR for $15 an hour to bored teenagers who texted under their desks. His expression carried the hollow look of a man who'd finally understood the cost of underestimating people. Who'd finally learned that some skills were earned in places where mistakes cost lives, not just careers. Katie pinned it to her refrigerator next to Daniel's latest report card, next to the photograph of Lieutenant Colonel Warren at his retirement ceremony shaking her hand, next to Warren's thank you note written in his careful military penmanship, "Your son would be proud of you, Red Hawk." I know I am. She made coffee and watched the sunrise through her kitchen window, the city waking up outside, the hospital waiting for her shift, her life existing now in both worlds simultaneously, the one that could be spoken about and the one that still lived in classified redactions. Daniel appeared, half asleep, asking what she was smiling about. She said, "Just remembering something someone told me once. The quietest person in the room might be holding it all together." He didn't understand but hugged her anyway, the way teenagers do when they sense their mother has stopped falling and started standing again. Her phone buzzed. Warren, back at the range this morning. Hands still work. So do I. Thank you for not letting me become another stat they could hide in a budget line. She texted back, thank you for writing to my son. By noon she was back at Seattle General, clocking in, checking the census, listening to the night shift report on 32 critical patients and 17 stable admits. The new resident saw her and straightened instinctively. The nurses nodded like soldiers acknowledging an officer. Dr. Chen waited by the medication dispensary with 2 cups of coffee and said, welcome back, Captain. Katie took the coffee and didn't correct her. In this place, in the fluorescent light and the beeping monitors and the controlled chaos of an ER that never slept, she could be both. Erased and visible. Soldier and healer. The woman who'd been ordered to disappear and the woman who'd saved a patient by operating on instinct learned under fire. Nobody could make her choose anymore. Nobody could force her into darkness. The country had tried to erase her and in doing so had given her back her name. If you found this story as powerful as we did, subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell so you never miss a story of hidden strength, quiet heroism, and the people the world underestimated until it was far too late. Like this video and tell us in the comments, have you ever been judged by someone who had no idea who you really were?